The New Mexico desert holds a silence heavier than its blistering midday heat. Carrizozo, a town forgotten by time, rests in this void like a faded photograph, every crack in its walls seeming to guard whispers from the past. The days drag on, identical, as the townspeople follow routines that feel more like rituals to keep the shadows at bay. But that night, the stagnant air shattered. First came the lights. They slashed the sky like incandescent blades, dancing across the horizon with a cold, impersonal glow. Then, a deep hum rose from the earth, making the ground tremble beneath the feet of those still awake. Nothing was said the next day, but eyes avoided the sky as if afraid to find something staring back. Ethan Grady watched. The former war photographer knew the sound of fear, but he had never heard it vibrating through the earth. His nightmares were once filled with explosions and distant screams, but now they were silenced by an approaching void. Then he saw her. On the dirt road winding into the heart of the desert, a figure staggered. Dust clung to her skin, her eyes glowing with something not of this world, and thin scars traced her body, as if etched by a scalpel. She muttered a single word: echoes. The town began to change. Radios crackled without cause, televisions flickered with distorted images, and animals vanished as if they had never existed. Eyes hid behind curtains, and familiar faces took on strange expressions. Carrizozo had always kept secrets, but now, those secrets seemed to be waking up. On the outskirts of town, shadows slid silently, watching. Whispers of the old military facility resurfaced, breaking through conversations sliced by fear. Amid the dust and heat, Ethan realized the answers he sought might be more terrifying than the questions. The lights would return, and when they did, the desert would never be the same. Because some presences never left. They only waited. The heat clung to the skin, even after sunset. In the New Mexico desert, night offered no relief, only a thick darkness that swallowed the landscape whole. Ethan Grady stood on the porch of the small house he had called home for a little over 3 years. The slow creak of the rocking chair was the only sound accompanying him. He absently turned a mug of cold coffee in his hands, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the desert in an unreadable shade of dark blue. He didn't know what he was looking for, but it was an old compulsion, something that made him observe, as if the camera he once carried during his days as a photographer was still hanging from his neck. The difference now was that there were no lenses between him and the world, and nothing seemed worth capturing. Then came the lights. At first, a timid flicker, almost mistaken for the stars already shining. Then, a beam sliced through the sky with precision, like a blade of white fire. Ethan frowned. The lights multiplied, dancing irregularly on the horizon. Planes? Number he knew how planes moved. This was something else. Then came the hum, a deep subterranean sound that made the wood beneath his feet subtly vibrate. Ethan stood still, eyes scanning the sky. The sound was constant, but seemed to pulse, like a distant heartbeat. He couldn't pinpoint its exact direction. It felt as though the entire desert was breathing with that noise. But suddenly, everything stopped. The lights vanished. The hum fell silent, and the desert returned to its heavy stillness. Ethan exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, feeling the tension finally release from his body. The next morning, Carrizozo seemed the same, but it wasn't. The townspeople avoided talking about the previous night. Ethan noticed it at the diner where he usually had coffee. Old Hank, the owner, kept the radio off, which was unusual. Conversations were whispered, and no one mentioned the lights. Clara, the local radio host, sat alone at the counter, scribbling in an old notebook. She noticed Ethan's gaze and gave him a slight nod. Clara had always been unusually interested in conspiracy theories, but today she seemed more serious. "You saw the lights too, didn't you?" she asked quietly, without looking up. Ethan hesitated. "I did, and I heard them." Clara lifted her darkened eyes. "They're coming back." Ethan didn't reply, not because he disagreed, but because something else unsettled him. There was something different in the air, something that couldn't be explained by mere lights in the sky. Later, driving down the dirt road that led to the heart of the desert, Ethan tried to shake off his unease. That's when he saw the figure stumbling ahead, a woman, covered in dust, hair stuck to her face, her skin marked by fine, almost artistic scars. She walked barefoot, her feet dragging through the sandy ground. Ethan slammed the brakes and got out, feeling the heat radiate from the ground. "Hey, are you okay?" he called, approaching cautiously. The woman slowly lifted her head. Her eyes. Something was wrong with them. It wasn't just the unusual glow. It was the way she looked at him, as if she could see through him. She opened her mouth but took a moment to speak. When she did, her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Echoes." The word hung in the air. Ethan instinctively took a step back. "What did you say? Do you need help?" She swayed. Ethan caught her before she collapsed. Her skin felt strange, too cold for the suffocating heat. Up close, he noticed the scars more clearly. Thin lines, like surgical incisions, but arranged in patterns that made no sense. Not knowing what else to do, Ethan took her home. In the hours that followed, she said nothing more. Every now and then, she would simply whisper that single word, "Echoes." That night, as Ethan tried to figure out who this woman was, the electronics in the house began to fail. The radio turned on by itself, hissing static. The hallway light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. And far off in the desert, something moved. The lights would return. But Ethan wasn't sure if he wanted to see them again. The night dragged on slowly, weighed down by a suffocating silence. Ethan watched the woman sleeping on the old couch in his living room. She looked vulnerable, curled under a faded blanket, but there was something unsettling about her stillness. The thin scars on her skin caught the dim light from the lamp, forming patterns Ethan couldn't decipher. Restless, he got up and walked to the kitchen. The coffee was cold, but he drank it anyway. He needed to stay alert. His thoughts spiraled endlessly. Who was she? What did echoes mean? A sharp crack made him spin around. The radio on the shelf turned on by itself, blasting sharp static. Ethan cautiously approached, reaching to turn it off. But before his hand could touch the dial, a voice whispered through the noise. "They are listening." The sound cut off. Ethan froze. The voice wasn't the woman's. It was something else. Before he could react, a dull thud echoed from the living room. Ethan rushed back and found the woman sitting up, panting, staring intensely at the front door. "They're here," she murmured, eyes wide with fear. "Who?" Ethan asked, but she didn't answer. A metallic scraping sound echoed from outside, like something dragging along the car's metal frame. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, its beam cutting through the darkness. The desert stood still, silent. He cautiously approached the car. Nothing seemed out of place. But when the flashlight swept across the side of the vehicle, Ethan froze. In the dust covering the hood, there were markings, not footprints but symbols, drawn by thin fingers. interwoven lines and circles, eerily similar to the scars on the woman's skin. A chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, something moved by the edge of the road. Ethan swung the flashlight around, its beam trembling slightly. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure, tall and thin, outlined against the darkness. But when he focused the light, it was gone. The radio inside the house crackled again. Without hesitation, Ethan sprinted back. Inside, the woman was standing, staring at the radio. She seemed more awake now, but her eyes were distant. "They want me to return," she whispered. "Who are they?" Ethan pressed. She slowly raised her hand and pointed toward the desert. "Those who never left." The next morning, the sun rose mercilessly, but the daylight didn't ease the tension. Ethan needed answers, and there was only one person who might help: Clara. At the small-town radio station, Clara was surrounded by scattered papers and scribbled maps. She looked up as Ethan entered, her face tired, but curious. "Came to ask about the lights?" she teased, but Ethan got straight to the point. "I need to know about the military facility, the one abandoned in the desert." Clara's face darkened. "No one talks about that place anymore. They say it was shut down after the Cold War. But there are rumors." She pulled out an old box from under the desk, filled with yellowed newspaper clippings. Experiments with non-human technology, secret tests in the desert. All speculation, of course. But there's more. People who vanished, like they were erased. Ethan sifted through the clippings until one headline caught his eye. "Woman found in desert with unusual markings. Case closed." The black and white photo showed a woman with scars similar to the ones on the stranger in his house. "This was over 20 years ago," Clara said grimly. "What happened to her?" Ethan asked, his stomach tightening. "No one knows. She disappeared shortly after being found." Ethan felt a cold wave wash over him. This couldn't be a coincidence. Clara gave him a hard look. "You found someone, didn't you?" He hesitated, then nodded, and she said something about echoes. Clara paled. Echoes. She was silent for a moment before whispering, "There's a theory. They say the facility researched something called frequency echoes, waves that could travel through space and time. But no one really knows." Ethan grasped the weight of those words. If that's true, maybe they're not just listening. Maybe they're calling something back. Clara bit her lip. Or maybe they never stopped. That night, Ethan dreamed of sand. He was alone in the desert, surrounded by shadows whispering in an incomprehensible tongue. The woman's scars glowed like fire beneath her skin. And then he saw it. On the horizon, something colossal rose from the dunes, formless, but present. And the lights were returning. Ethan woke up gasping, a deep hum vibrating in the air. And outside, at the edge of the darkness, eyes were watching him. Dawn broke under a pale sky, stained with shades of gray that didn't belong in the desert. Ethan watched the horizon from his porch, feeling the growing weight of something invisible. The woman was still asleep, but her rest was anything but peaceful. Her body twitched in small spasms, as if she were fighting something in her dreams. Clara had promised to meet Ethan by evening. She claimed to have more information about the abandoned military facility. But Ethan knew he couldn't wait. Every second felt like it was pulling him deeper into a web he was already entangled in. He decided to act, leaving the sleeping woman with a brief note. "I'll be back soon. Don't open the door." He grabbed the old pickup truck. The engine roared, muffled by the desert wind. The road to the facility wasn't marked on any map, but Clara had hastily sketched out some coordinates based on old rumors. Ethan followed barely visible trails, where the cracked earth seemed to swallow the tire tracks. For hours, there was nothing but silence and sand, until he saw it. The facility emerged like a wound in the desert, a cluster of sunken concrete structures surrounded by rusted barbed wire fences. Faded signs warned, government property, no trespassing. But there were no guards, no cameras, no signs of life. The gate hung ajar. Ethan entered. The air here was colder, heavier, as if even the wind avoided this place. Rust coated everything, and the buildings seemed on the verge of collapse. But there was something else, a metallic scent, mixed with dampness and dust. While exploring, Ethan found a half-buried metal hatch beneath rubble. He forced it open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Without hesitation, he climbed down. The smell worsened. The narrow, concrete-lined corridor stretched ahead. Ethan moved silently, the sound of his own footsteps the only thing echoing back at him. Strange symbols covered the walls, similar to the ones he had seen scratched on his car and carved into the woman's skin. At the end of the hall, a steel door stood slightly open. Ethan slowly pushed it, revealing a dimly lit room with no apparent light source. And then, he saw it. In the center of the room stood a circular structure, like a twisted antenna, wrapped in cables and surrounded by shattered monitors. The walls were plastered with old photographs of people, missing people, familiar faces from Carrizozo, men, women, even children, all bearing the same scars. And there were recordings. Ethan pressed play on one of them. The screen flickered to life, showing black and white footage of men in lab coats adjusting controls. In the background, someone spoke. Frequency tests initiated. The object responded. The camera trembled. The image shifted, revealing a figure behind observation glass, humanoid but misshapen, shrouded in shadow. They listened, and they answered. The recording cut off. Ethan's stomach churned. This wasn't about contact. The facility wasn't trying to reach out. They had brought something here, something that was never meant to be. Suddenly, a low hum echoed down the corridor behind him. Ethan spun around, but no one was there. Then, whispers. Indistinct words, overlapping, like distorted human voices bouncing off the walls. Without thinking, Ethan ran. Bursting out of the facility, he noticed the sky was darkening. But it wasn't nightfall. Black clouds gathered unnaturally, swallowing the sun. He sped back toward Carrizozo, but when he arrived, something was wrong. The streets were empty. Houses stood with doors ajar, windows shattered. Radios hissed static inside abandoned homes. The silence was suffocating. Ethan sprinted to his house. The door was open. No. He rushed in, his heart pounding. The living room was empty. The blanket from the couch lay crumpled on the floor. But something was scrawled on the wall, written in something dark, maybe blood, maybe dirt. Echoes. Ethan's knees nearly gave out. Before he could react, the television turned on by itself. The screen crackled with static, but through the noise, Clara's terrified face flashed for an instant. She was trapped somewhere dark. And then, a deep voice rumbled through the house. "There's no more time." The screen went black. Ethan stood frozen, feeling the house subtly vibrate, like something was drawing closer. And outside, the lights had returned. But this time, they were closer. The lights tore through the sky like liquid blades, pulsing in colors beyond description. Ethan could feel the hum, not just in his ears, but deep within his bones, vibrating through his entire body. The house seemed to shrink around him, the walls breathing slowly, as if they were alive. He needed to get out. Now Ethan grabbed the flashlight and the old shotgun leaning in the corner of the room. a leftover from the previous tenant, who had vanished without a trace years ago. Ethan had never liked guns, but something inside him told him this wasn't about logic anymore. This was instinct, survival. Outside, the town was dead. Dust swirled in the air, and the silence was broken only by the distant crackle of static on abandoned radios and doors creaking in the wind. Ethan ran through the empty streets, the sound of his own footsteps echoing between the buildings. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of Clara. But something was watching him. He could feel it. In the reflections of shattered windows, distorted shadows moved out of sync, like images flickering offbeat. He didn't know if they were real, or just echoes of something much older. Ethan headed for the radio station. Clara might be there. The door was ajar, groaning softly in the wind. The air smelled of dust and burnt electronics. The station was in ruins, equipment overturned, papers scattered across the floor. But Clara was nowhere to be found. Then, he heard it. A whisper, barely audible. He followed the sound to the broadcast room. The microphone was on, transmitting nothing but static. But beneath the noise, voices overlapped, endlessly repeating one word: echoes. Ethan approached cautiously. On the monitor beside the console, a video began to play on its own. It was Clara. She was in a dark room, trembling. Behind her, the same symbols as the woman's scars were drawn on the walls. If anyone's listening, they're not from out there. They're from here. They've always been here. Clara's voice cracked. The facility wasn't built to make contact. It was built to contain. They opened it, and they could never close it. The recording cut off. Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't about aliens. It never was. The real terror didn't come from the stars. It came from the earth itself, from the forgotten depths beneath Carrizozo. A sound snapped Ethan back to the moment. The woman. She stood in the doorway, watching him with those impossible eyes. "They're waking up," she whispered. "Who are they?" Ethan demanded. "Who are you?" She tilted her head, as if struggling to remember. I was like you, but they took me, remade me." The scars on her skin seemed to pulse. Echoes are memories that shouldn't exist. They are what's left of what they tried to destroy. A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. "The facility, is it still running?" The woman nodded slowly. "It's alive, like a wound that never heals." Ethan tightened his grip on the shotgun. "Then let's end this." The drive back to the facility was faster this time. The sky was darker, the lights danced on the horizon, and the hum seemed to rise from beneath the ground. Inside the facility, the air was thicker. The concrete halls seemed to breathe, the walls subtly pulsing. The woman led Ethan forward, moving as if she knew every corner of this underground maze. They reached the main chamber. At its center, the circular structure Ethan had seen before was now active. Metallic rings rotated slowly, emitting a pale, sickly glow. Cables vibrated like restrained tendrils. "This is where it started," the woman murmured, "and this is where it must end." Ethan stepped closer, examining the dusty control panel. Lights flickered erratically. "How do we shut it down?" She hesitated. "We can't. Not without giving something in return." Ethan stared at her. "What do you mean?" She turned away, her eyes glowing faintly. "They don't accept silence. They need a voice, a mind, a body." Panic flickered inside him. "No." Before he could move, the woman advanced. She placed her hand on the structure, and the scars on her skin blazed with light. The machine groaned, the metallic rings spinning wildly. "They need me more than you," she said softly, a sad smile on her lips. The lights exploded in a brilliant flash. The hum became a scream. Ethan was thrown backward. When he opened his eyes, the room was silent. The machine was dead. The woman was gone. But Ethan knew he wasn't alone. Outside, the desert was still. Carrizozo looked asleep, but deep down, Ethan knew they hadn't left. They had merely retreated, waiting, because some echoes never fade, and the desert returned to silence. But a silence that watches, as if something still breathes beneath the sand. Ethan knows the answers are lost in the shadows, and Carrizozo will never be the same. But what about you? Can you hear the echoes? If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to The Traveler, Alien Abductions and Encounters, and leave a comment. Do you believe some secrets should stay buried? Prepare yourself, traveler, because the lights always return.